Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the fourth chapter of the first epistle to the Thessalonians. Thessalonica was a city located in Macedon. Paul first visited it on his first missionary journey, so the writing of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is the chronologically earliest, with the exception of Galatians, and what comes after it in chronological terms was the two epistles to the Corinthian assembly, which he visited on his second journey. So not long after founding these assemblies during his first in Galatia and in Thessalonica, the problems crept in since he had left it on firm footing, because the doctrinal distortion which he contended with in Galatians was that of the Judaizers, who added in an admixture of Jewish legalism to the new Christian faith, and that of the Thessalonians was a doctrinal distortion of the second coming. So certain people had crept in and confused the believers that Paul had sort of set on the right path, saying that the second coming was imminent, there was no need to work, so there was a plague of laziness, and every chapter in the first book of Thessalonians at least closes with an explanation and a promise of the second coming to come, which has not come yet, but it will come still. But since the very early age, a lot of the apostles, in fact, believed that it would manifest, the second coming would manifest in their own lifetime, but that did not excuse any laziness in spreading the kingdom. In other words, we have the promise of the kingdom to come that does not absolve us of the duty and obligation to spread the kingdom in whatever limited ways it can before its full manifestation comes into the earth. So the opening verse of the fourth chapter reads, "For the rest then, brethren, we beg you and call upon you in the Master Yahshua, that as you receive from us how you should walk and to please Elohim, that you should excel still more." So he had instructed them on how to walk, that is, how to live. Another way of saying how to live the Christian life, embody the Christian virtues, enact the Christian principles in our daily interaction. But from this foundation, he wants them to grow and progress and mature. So that also necessitates the writing of the letter. Paul, being a physical man in a physical frame, could not be in more than one location at any given time. So he communicated to several of these places he had left behind on somewhat firm footing that had kind of deteriorated in his absence via epistle. Necessity was the mother of this invention. So in the Old Testament, we don't read of any doctrinal communications via epistle. That's because Israel was geographically insular, but the new Christian faith was pan-national since its inception, and because he heard through the grapevine throughout the Mediterranean, he would communicate doctrinally sound truths to these assemblies that are somewhat they're in confusion and they need some correction. "For you know what commands we gave you through the Master Yahshua." He's reminding them of that which they still should know, but implicitly some of them did not seem to remember that which he had taught and instructed them, hence necessitating the repetition of this statement. "For this is the will of Elohim, your saints, that you should abstain from whoring." So whoring is self-evident. That's a vice, not a virtue. It's a sexual sin to pay for sex, or that falls in the category of fornication. So it's not technically adultery, because no prostitute rarely is a prostitute anyone's wives, and the customer doesn't necessarily have to be married to step outside of their wife for sex, but this is the will of the Father, that we not defile ourselves through sexual sin, because it contaminates the purity of our souls when we step outside the Creator's boundaries and parameters of appropriate sexual behavior. "That each one of you should know how to possess his own vessel in sacredness and respect." So we all have individual vessels, which are the fruits of the Spirit that we carry within us and around us and to others. And so even though this can be interpreted as individually insular, your own vessels. It is for the collective and the community. So we live and exist as not, I hate to say self-autonomous units, because strictly speaking, there is no self to speak of in the Christian life, but there is some measure of truth that we are independently functioning beings and creatures, but we cannot exist apart from others in society and community. So we owe it to ourselves and each other to keep our own houses in order, mind our own stores, and attend to our own betterment in order that others might be bettered through our own, or improved through our own self-betterment efforts and exercises. Not in passion of lust, like the Gentiles who do not know Elohim. Now, most of his audience in the Thessalonians would have been Gentiles by background, but he's drawing a clear distinction between Gentiles. That is a term, is not an ethnic one. It is a term of those who are unsaved. So the Gentiles were estranged from Elohim in the knowledge of salvation until Paul kind of brought it to them. He, above all others, he was designated the evangelist and the apostle to the uncircumcised as early as Acts 9:15. Not to overstep and take advantage of his brother in this matter, because the master is the revenger of all such, and we indeed said to you before, and earnestly warned. The temptation is almost always present to take advantage of a brother, whether they be in the flock or outside of the flock. There is no amount of Christianity can render one immune from this temptation, but it is an act of faith to cede vengeance to the Father in heaven in his own way, in his own time. It may not come as soon as we would like. It may not even come in this lifetime, but rest assured it will come in the next life. So those who take advantage of us, walk all over us, step on us, we are to turn the other cheek and look the other way in as much as is practical or possible, with perfect faith that the Master will inflict his perfect vengeance on the purveyors of iniquity who injure us and abuse us. For Elohim did not call us to uncleanness, but in sanctity. So we are not called to continue. A lot of these Gentiles came from, they had little moral instruction, at least in the religious systems they came from. The idols they worshipped were not moral role models. So he's calling them to a higher standard of sanctity, which is distinct from the uncleanliness which they would have known and walked and lived and experienced in. Therefore, he who rejects this does not reject man, but Elohim, who also gives us his Ruach Kadesh. So we can't take personal rejection personally, because in the end of the day, in the final analysis, if we communicate the good news message faithfully and accurately, they are not rejecting us, they are rejecting the one whom we speak on behalf. We are his mouthpieces. So rejection is part of the job of personal evangelism. Not everyone's going to like or listen to what you have to say, but remember always that they are not rejecting you, but the one in whose name you proclaim and are trying to lead them to. He also blessed us and endowed us with the gift of the Ruach Kadesh, without which personal evangelism could not be effective, or nearly as, even remotely as effective as it could be apart from him. We, no amount of rationality can substitute for the indwelling and empowering spirit, and the ministry of conversion is not ours. The ministry of conversion is a solely divine working. Our ministry is to spread the message of conversion so that others might hear and respond, and the Ruach Kadesh can implement the conversion in them through our words. And it is not necessary to write to you about brotherly love, for you yourselves are taught by Elohim to love one another. So brotherly love is something almost redundant at this point. We kind of take it for granted, but it's one of those virtues we cannot overlook. It is self-evident to the sustainment of any community which exists in unity and equality. We have to love our brother as we would love ourselves. But that's something they already know, and that's something they had been taught. Paul doesn't say he taught them. He says Elohim taught them. It is part of his nature and his will, and self-evident that when we are loving our brothers, we are loving the one above us, and that is commensurate with his will and his purpose for men, especially the men who belong, or the people rather, who belong to his chosen and called, which is the church. For in fact, you do so toward all the brothers who are in all Macedonia, but we call upon you, brothers, that you do so more and more. So he's not calling for the average or ordinary or matter of course brotherly love. He's asking for extra, so to go above and beyond that which is natural or even they think necessary. There is no such thing as too much brotherly love, at least. We cannot get enough of it. It's something we cannot do without and something we should not deprive others of. And Macedonia was located to the north of the territory which would have been labeled Achaia by the Roman masters, but it corresponds to the modern country of Greece. And to make it your ambition to live peaceably, and to attend to your own, and to work with your own hands, as we command you. Remember, we mentioned in the early preamble, the distorted doctrinal teachings of the second coming had induced a plague of laziness amongst the Thessalonians, because these people who didn't really know quite what they were talking about said that it was imminent, so there was no need to work. He was going to come any day now, so stop what you're doing, stop providing for your family, stop working, he's going to come any day now, and that they taught a distorted picture of this doctrine, that the imminence of it could absolve one of the duties and obligations to bring the kingdom, because the kingdom was going to come to us totally and fully any day now. So he's telling them to work with his hands. This is something Paul did, as were all Jewish rabbis trained and conditioned. They made their living through manual labor. Paul was a tent maker by profession, and this is a command, so he's telling them that he's commanding you. He's not recommending or offering it as a piece of advice. It is a command from Paul, which is as good as a command from the Father himself. So that you behave decently towards those who are outside, and not be in any need. Outside the church, we exist in the world, yet apart from it, but we are to be separate from the world, but not unconcerned for its welfare. We are to periodically step in the dens of iniquity without exposing ourselves to the own line of fire. I'm sure you're all familiar with the saying that if you stay in a barber shop long enough, you will get a haircut. So we are not to excessively immerse ourselves in the affairs of the world, but we are to be mindful. This is where evangelism comes from. The two duties of a church are evangelism, which is reaching out, and edification, which is strengthening those who are already within. And he doesn't want them to be dependent. He doesn't want a growing class of parasites, because one of the church's early jobs was, before the government kind of took over the welfare service, at least in our modern history, the church made provisions for the truly destitute, but those who are capable of providing for themselves should not be a burden or a liability, because if you can provide for yourself, you may as well do it, but there's a lot of people who can't, and their destitution is somewhat more justifiable than those who can but won't. Now, brethren, we do not want you to be ignorant concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you be sad as others who have no hope. The term fallen asleep is a reference to death. This is the concluding benediction. The 13th through 18th verse are his explanation of the second coming, and his so there's a lot of ignorance at this moment in time, because a lot of false teachers or people who didn't quite know what they were really talking about had spread confusion concerning this doctrine in Thessalonian. And he's telling them, he's not telling them not to grieve, only to grieve differently, because when our faith in the resurrection is total and firm and secure and reliable, we have no real need to grieve, because the people, the loved ones, and the friends we just lost, they aren't really they never really left us. They just simply changed addresses, and they're waiting for us in our heavenly home. And so there's really, there's an appropriate extent of mourning and grieving for the loss of the loved ones and the friends and the family, but it's almost not appropriate or necessary to mourn as if we would never see them again, because that's the way that the world kind of mourns. They have no hope of the resurrection. They have no exalted expectation of a life after this death, but they are to know better. And he's setting in line, he's clarifying the confusion that these false teachers had kind of sown amongst the people he had kind of grown. He planted the assembly at Thessalonian. He was the evangelist who evangelized that city, but then these people crept in his absence after he left and sort of spread this confusion. That's why he's writing this epistle, to correct and clarify the confusion that they had induced. For if we believe that Yahshua died and rose again, so also Elohim shall bring with him those who sleep in Yahshua. So Yahshua is likened to the first fruit of the resurrection, and it's through his resurrection that we may be resurrected. So that's the greatest gift and the greatest miracle and the central, most crucial and yet controversial claim of Christianity, that we will be resurrected from the dead, because our master, the namesake of our religion, proved that he was divine and sent from the Father, and was divine by because he was raised up by the Father. And that is something that he shares with us unworthy creatures who are independently incompetent to induce the resurrection in our natural form. It is wholly and totally and completely a supernatural process, which we can attain and benefit from, but only inasmuch as we remain faithful and obedient to the principles of its manifestation as outlined in this book, not just 1 Thessalonians, but the entire book, Old New Testament, just the Bible in general. For we say to you by the word of the Master, that we, the living who are left over at the coming of the Master, shall in no way go before those who are asleep. So he's saying this by the word of the Master. This is as if it was directly from the Master himself, that the living who are left over, those who are alive at that time at the coming of the Master, will join the dead who are asleep. And this is known as the doctrine of the rapture. He's going to come from the sky and lift us up to heaven from earth, those who are living. And it's actually not... We shouldn't really envy those who are living, because they're going to be at the tail end of the tribulation, which is literally the most devastating period for Christians in any historical era, past, present, or future. But they can look to that blessed hope and expectation, and those who are going to die will be risen up. Now, there are some exceptions. Now, this grand event is to be understood as a universal, once and for all resurrection, but there are some exceptions, such as Moses and Elijah, who appeared in resurrected form from the transfiguration. So there are, in fact, saints who were resurrected, in fact, before the Old Testament saints, before the first fruit of the resurrection, but it's through the same power and through the same grace that they are resurrected. But for us, we kind of have to lay in limbo while we... not quite purgatory, but not quite resurrected, while we have sort of departed from this earth. So that's just, something we're going to have to deal with. It's not a blessing, it's not a curse, although it does lead to a great blessing. Because the Master himself shall come down from the heavens with a shout, with the voice of a chief angel, and with the trumpet of Elohim, and the dead in the Messiah shall rise first. So earlier I mentioned that we will be, the living will be lifted at the same time as the dead. I stand corrected. The dead will be living first, but the Master is going to come from the heaven with a shout, accompanied by musical instruments and preceded by the voice of a chief angel. So we can imagine that's either Gabriel or Michael, the archangel, the two angels to whom we know are named in the scripture. And so those who are dead will rise first, but then we who are living, if we are lucky, and again, I don't envy anyone who is living at that time, because they would they kind of have to go through the ringer to earn the resurrection. They're going to be tested in ways that we at least living. And I'm not categorically excluding the possibility that this grand event could happen in our own lifetimes, because, the end times are encroaching. We do have the signs, we do have the warnings, we do have the prophecies, and it is obvious to anyone who is paying attention to the world and is familiar with the doctrines of this book that the end times are seriously encroaching and getting close. Then we, the living, who are left over, shall be caught away together with them in the clouds to meet the Master in the air, and so shall we always be with the Master. So the living, those who are on the earth in the midst of life at this grand event, will be caught away together. That means all at once, with them, that being the dead who are resurrected. They precede us, they're risen first, and we're going to meet them in the clouds, and we who are living are going to meet the Master in the air from whence he comes and condescends to reach down to resurrect us, and then we will be always and forever with the Master, the first fruit of the resurrection, without whom the resurrection would not be possible or available to us. So then, encourage one another with these words. So we gather that some of the confusion concerning the processes and the expectations of this doctrine were discouraging. We're not privy to the exact contents of these doctrinal distorters who had crept into the Thessalonian assemblies, but for whatever reason we can accurately surmise that they had spread discouragement, but Paul's calling them to uplift and encourage one another, to edify them with this with the details and the specifics and the correct understanding of this doctrine, which correctly understood and applied is a source of encouragement. So I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. Bye-bye. See you soon.